cold night in late 1941, Jack Newton, an RAF gunner shot down over Belgium, crossed a rickety rope bridge into Spain. The Bidassoa River churned 100 feet below. He did not look down. Step by careful step, he moved across the swaying slats. But crossing into Spain was only the beginning of his fight for freedom. That harrowing escape was the culmination of a journey that began months earlier, in the spring of 1941, when Jack Newton was a young airman in London. It was the spring of 1941, and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. In London, a young airman named Jack Newton had just married his childhood sweetheart, Mary, on April 19th. The ceremony was small, the reception modest, a restaurant with its windows blown out by German bombs. They joked that Hitler would not spoil their wedding day. 12 weeks later, on the night of August the 5th, Jack Newton climbed into the front gun turret of a Wellington bomber. It was his first operational mission over Germany. He had traded places with another gunner, a simple swap that would determine everything that followed. The target was Aachen, a city on the Belgian border. As the engines roared to life, Jack touched the pocket of his battle dress where he kept Mary's photograph. What no one on board that Wellington could know was that this flight would not end with a routine return to base. The 6 men of Crew G for George were about to begin a journey that would test the very limits of survival, and one of them would accomplish something no British airman had yet achieved in this war. The Wellington crossed the Dutch coast and climbed towards its bombing altitude. Searchlights swept the sky, and flak began to burst in dark puffs around them. Jack Newton tested his twin Browning machine guns, sending short bursts into the night sky. The skipper, Flight Lieutenant Roy Langlois, kept the plane steady as the bomb aimer prepared their payload over Aachen. Langlois opened the bomb doors. The 1,000-pound bomb dropped first, followed by 3 500-pounders and a basket of incendiaries. The tire factory below erupted in flames, but as Langlois turned for home, a shell slammed into the starboard engine. Fire erupted from the cowling, bright and hungry against the dark sky. Langlois pressed the fire extinguisher button. The flames died back, then returned. He pressed it again, and again the fire rekindled. Finally, he shut down the engine and feathered the propeller. The Wellington began to lose altitude, a crippled bird limping westward. The wireless operator, Richard Copley, sent out SOS calls. The crew threw everything they could overboard: guns, ammunition, even their makeshift urine bottles filled with champagne empties. Langlois knew they could not make the North Sea. The plane was falling too fast. Below them, the spires of Antwerp rose into the moonlight. Jack Newton, still in the front turret, saw it first, a dark strip of runway barely visible in the blacked-out landscape. "Down there, Skip," he called over the intercom. "An airfield. Can we make it?" Langlois banked the crippled bomber sharply to port. There was no room for error, no second chance. He dropped the landing gear, and the wheels locked into place with a reassuring clunk. The runway rushed up to meet them with only one engine working. The Wellington crabbed sideways as Langlois wrestled the controls, aiming for the concrete strip. The wheels touched down with 50 feet of runway to spare. The crew sat in stunned silence for 1 heartbeat, then 2. Langlois cut the remaining engine. "Time to go," he said. They tumbled out onto the tarmac, and Richard Copley fired a flare into the fuselage. The Wellington began to burn, a beacon against the night sky. In the distance, they heard the sound of German vehicles starting up. The 6 men ran for the perimeter fence and disappeared into the darkness of occupied Belgium. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 6, 1941, 3 exhausted airmen crouched in a Belgian cornfield. Flight Sergeant Jack Newton, Flight Lieutenant Roy Langlois, and Sergeant Richard Copley lay still among the stooks, listening for German patrols. A young cyclist appeared at the hedge, a Belgian resistance man named Richard Dumoulin. He led them to the farm of Alphonse de Voigt, where Madame de Voigt served them weak coffee and handed them a pile of second-hand civilian clothes. After changing, the 3 men wrapped their RAF flying gear and buried it under a shed behind the farmhouse, concealing the spot so the Germans would not find it. Newton pulled on a gray suit 2 sizes too big, a long overcoat, and a black beret. His dark complexion and growing mustache made him look like a local. The 3 men wrapped their RAF battle dress jackets beneath their new clothes, a precaution. If the Germans caught them, the uniforms underneath proved they were soldiers, not spies. The de Voigts then moved a shed over the buried gear. For the next 10 days, the airmen shuttled between safe houses in Antwerp, always one step ahead of the German search parties combing the countryside. By mid-August, Newton, Langlois, and Copley had been moved to Liège. There they met a former Belgian Air Force pilot named Emile Whitmire, the local resistance chief. Whitmire looked at the three men with cold, appraising eyes. Someone in the network had raised an alarm. A few weeks earlier, the Germans had dressed 6 English-speaking agents in RAF uniforms and sent them to infiltrate Belgian escape lines. Whitmire had already shot those impostors. Now he wondered if these 3 were another German trick. Whitmire ordered the 3 airmen separated and interrogated in different rooms at the Hôtel de Provence. Newton faced a barrage of questions: his father's name, the street at the end of his road, the shape of a RAF form 295, the name of his wife. Whitmire's voice was flat, businesslike. He told Newton that if the answers did not check out, he would be taken into the yard and shot in the head. Whitmire radioed London, reading off Newton's details. Hours later, the reply came back. Jack Newton was who he said he was. The men were authentic British aircrew. With their identities confirmed, the 3 airmen were split up. Langlois and Copley remained in Brussels, where they would later be captured in a sewer raid. Newton was moved to the home of Max and Celine Evrard in the town of Waterloo. The Evrards lived in a house requisitioned by the Germans. 2 young soldiers slept in a bedroom upstairs. Newton hid in the basement, and the family's Westland Terrier growled every time a German passed by, giving him warning. For 3 weeks he stayed quiet, listening to the crunch of jackboots overhead. Confinement began to wear on Newton. He had not seen sunlight in weeks. One afternoon, alone in the house, he slipped out the back door into the garden. He crossed the field beyond the hedge, breathing the cold October air. A German soldier appeared on the path ahead and shouted for his papers. Newton knew he had no identity card. In one motion, he punched the soldier hard under the helmet strap, knocking the man unconscious. He kicked the rifle away, ran back through the garden gate, and told the Evrards what he had done. Within hours, a resistance guide arrived to move him to a new safe house in Schaerbeek, Brussels. That new safe house belonged to a nun named Antoinette Becquet. She lived alone in a 3-story house and welcomed Newton with a warm embrace and 2 continental kisses. Her brother, a monk who carried 2 Colt .45 revolvers under his robe, visited twice a week, bringing smuggled wine and news from the outside. Beckett cared for Newton as if he were her own son. She cooked for him, tucked him into bed, and gave him a goodnight kiss on the forehead each evening before locking his door from the outside for his protection. When Newton developed a throbbing toothache from 2 cracked teeth, Beckett arranged a dentist visit under a cover story. She presented him as her Spanish nephew who did not speak French. The dentist drilled out the cavities, but there was not enough silver filling to finish the job. Newton reached into his battle-dress pocket and produced 2 King George VI silver coins, good luck tokens from his aunt. The dentist melted them down and used the silver to fill Newton's teeth. One of those fillings remained in his mouth for the next 60 years. The other was lost when the tooth was later extracted. One afternoon, Becquet asked Newton to read aloud to her from a Penguin novel. He opened to Psalm 107 and read, "He led them forth by the right way, that they might go to the city where they dwelt." The words struck him so deeply that he tore the page from the book and carried it through the rest of the war as his talisman. In London, Mary Newton kept a diary during her husband's long silence. She wrote down every scrap of hope, every fear, every sleepless night. A coded Christmas telegram arrived from the Evrards in Waterloo, signed Jacques Céline, with hints that Jack was alive, but Mary did not decipher the clues. She recorded the date in her diary, puzzled, and moved on. The Air Ministry told her only that 2 crewmen were interned in unoccupied France and that nothing further was known of Sergeant Newton. Autumn passed without a second letter. Mary wrote on December the 22nd. A telegram from one of the captured crew said Newton and the other 2 were safe and in good hands. She read the line over and over. 5 months of waiting, and her husband was not dead. He was somewhere in hiding, moving through a world she could not see. She noted in her diary that she felt years younger and that she would say a special prayer that night. Jack Newton left Antoinette Becket's house in Schaerbeek in early November, carrying the torn page of Psalm 107 in his pocket. He was taken to a new safe house in Brussels where he met a young woman who would change everything. Her name was André de Jong, codenamed Dédé, which meant Little Mother. She was 24 years old, small and dark-haired, and she led the Comet escape line across Belgium and France. She told Newton he would not cross the Channel. He would go south over the Pyrenees into Spain. Dédé handed him his new identity, Jacques Dumonceau, a commercial traveler from the Landes region in southern France. The forged card bore his photograph from an automatic booth at a Bon Marché store. Newton studied the paper, the stamp, the signature, and knew his life now depended on this single document. That night, with Dédé leading and 3 other escapers following in single file, they waded across the river Somme into occupied France. The water reached their chests. No one spoke. The group caught the southbound express from the Gare d'Austerlitz in Paris to Bayonne. Newton sat by the window in a compartment with 2 elderly French women. He opened a newspaper wide across his face and began peeling an orange, just as Dédé had instructed. The strong citrus smell filled the compartment, and the women turned away in distaste. Twice the train was stopped for document checks. Each time, the gendarmes glanced at his card, Jacques Dumonceau, born in Dax, and handed it back without a second look. In Bayonne, a young resistance girl named Janine de Grief met them outside the station toilets and led them through town to her mother's villa in Anglet. Elvire de Grief, Tante Go, ran the southern terminus of the Comet line from this house. She fed them real coffee, bread, and even steak from black market supplies. Newton and his companions slept 5 to a bed, fully dressed, with Dédé in the middle between the 2 married men. After 3 days of rest, the weather cleared, and Florentino, the Basque mountain guide, arrived to lead them over the Pyrenees. They left at dusk, climbing through mist and loose scree for 17 hours. By midnight, they reached the Bidassoa River, the last physical barrier before Spain. The river was in flood, brown water roaring past at a speed that would knock a man off his feet. Florentino and Dédé conferred in low voices. Then Dédé turned to the men and told them the crossing was impossible. They would have to walk back. The party retraced the entire climb in silence, exhausted and defeated. When they reached the farmhouse near Urunia, Newton stood in the yard and spat on the ground. Dédé rounded on him. "Do not spit on this beloved country," she said, her voice sharp with emotion. Newton stared at her, then apologized. He was not spitting on France, he told her. He was spitting on the Germans who had driven him to this. She accepted his apology, and they stood together in the dark farmhouse kitchen, both close to tears. They would wait for the river to fall and try again. The next attempt would take them to a rickety rope bridge, a border post, and finally, freedom. The night was cold and still. Deep in the gorge, the Bidassoa River still roared in flood, but Florentino had made his decision. The rope bridge 5 hours upstream was their only way into Spain. Jack Newton, Larry Burke, Gerard Waquez, and Howard Carroll followed the Basque guide in single file through the darkness, their rope-soled espadrilles finding grip on the loose scree. Below them, a single floodlight from the Spanish customs post threw its white beam across the swaying wooden slats. Florentino crossed first, his huge frame testing each rope and plank. The bridge groaned under his weight, but it held. He reached the far bank, dropped to his knees, and crawled beneath the customs window. The guards were not stirring. One by one, each man took his turn on the bridge. Jack Newton stepped onto the slats and felt the whole structure tilt beneath him. 100 feet below, the river churned against the rocks. He did not look down. He crossed step by careful step, and when his feet touched Spanish soil, he dropped flat and crawled past the glowing window without a sound. Larry Burke crossed next, then Howard Carroll, then Gerard Waquez. Last came André de Jong moving across the bridge like a shadow, her feet barely disturbing the planks. The entire group reunited on the railway track beyond the customs post. They crouched low, said nothing, and followed Florentino into the dark mouth of a tunnel. On the other side, the valley opened into open countryside. The town of Renteria lay ahead. The guards had not fired a single shot. Dawn found the 5 men hidden inside a water tower on the hillside outside Renteria. The container was wrapped in straw, and the space between the wooden jacket and the iron tank was just large enough for 4 men to stretch out. They had pushed the straw aside and made themselves a nest. André de Jong had gone ahead into San Sebastian to alert the British consulate. She returned a few hours later, her face calm, and led the men down the slope toward the tram stop that ran along the coast. Each man held a single peseta note that André de Jong had given them, their fare for the tram into San Sebastian. They bought their tickets and boarded separately, sitting apart from one another, pretending to be strangers. The tram rattled past the Fuenterrabia lighthouse and along the crescent of the bay. Jack Newton pressed his face to the window and saw the British flag flying above a white building near the harbor wall. The consulate. The gates were unguarded. One by one, they stepped off the tram and walked straight through the entrance. Inside the British consulate in San Sebastian, the formalities were brief. André de Jong identified her packages to Vice Consul Arthur Dean, who took charge of the men. Jack Newton was debriefed that same afternoon at the British Seamen's Rest Home in Bilbao. He told his story from the crash landing on Dern Airfield to the rope bridge crossing. He named the resistance families who had hidden him, the towns he had passed through, the German positions he had observed. For 2 days he sat in a quiet room, giving every scrap of information the intelligence officers wanted. Then a black Daimler wearing diplomatic plates pulled up at the door. It was time for Madrid. The ambassador's car carried Jack Newton south across the Spanish plain. The chauffeur said little. The armed escort in the front seat kept his eyes on the road. Jack Newton sat alone in the back, the darkened windows shielding him from the outside world. For hours he watched the landscape roll past, olive groves, whitewashed villages, empty roads. He had not felt this still since the night he climbed into the front turret of the Wellington, 4 months and 1,000 miles ago. At the British Embassy in Madrid, Ambassador Sir Samuel Hoare received the 3 escapees in a quiet ceremony in the embassy chapel. There were handshakes, congratulations, and a feast laid out on trestle tables. The ambassador took Jack Newton aside and asked if he could offer any token of the occasion. Jack Newton reached into his battle dress and pulled out Mary's prayer book, the one she had given him on their wedding day, the one he had carried through every safe house and across every border. Sir Samuel Hoare wrote on the inside cover, "With good wishes," he stamped it with the embassy seal and dated it. Then he handed it back. It was the closest the British government would come to acknowledging what Jack Newton had done. The same evening, Jack Newton sat at a small desk in the embassy and wrote a cablegram to his wife, alive, safe, and well interned. He gave it to the air attaché, who radioed it to London. In Twickenham, Mary Newton received the message the following morning. She had spent 5 months not knowing if she was a widow. She read the words, folded the paper, and began packing her things. Her husband was coming home. The Sunderland flying boat touched down at Pembroke Dock on the afternoon of January 14, 1942. For Newton, the moment he stepped onto British soil felt surreal. After 5 months of hiding, climbing, and dodging the enemy, he was home. But there was no fanfare. A debriefing officer shook his hand and said, "Welcome home," then led him to a room for hours of questions. He repeated his story from the crash landing to the Pyrenees, naming every resistance family, every safe house, every detail the intelligence officers demanded. When they finally released him, he took the train to London. Mary was waiting at his parents' house in St. John's Wood. She threw her arms around him and held on without speaking. That first night, Newton stayed up talking, showing her the prayer book Ambassador Hoare had signed, and the torn page of Psalm 107 he still carried in his pocket. A week after his return, Newton received an urgent summons to an M9 safe house in Beaconsfield. The intelligence officers had a Belgian civilian in custody who claimed to know him, a man calling himself Captain Frederick Hulot. Newton studied the man through a one-way mirror and recognized him immediately. During his time in Brussels, Hulot had been one of the resistance helpers who kept him hidden, and before leaving he had given Newton a pair of brown brogue shoes. Newton slipped one of his shoes off and handed it to the interrogator. "Ask him what he gave me," he said. The officer took the shoe to Hulot, who identified it without hesitation. The suspicion evaporated. Hulot was genuine, and Newton's identification helped secure his release from M9's scrutiny. By the summer of 1944, Newton was living with Mary and their infant daughter Jacqueline in a flat in Crystal Palace, London. He was stationed at a training unit in Southport and often brought his family up for long weekends. On one such visit in July, a telegram arrived from Mary's father. A V-1 flying bomb had struck the block of flats. The news hit like a physical blow. Newton caught the first train back to London. Standing outside the shattered building, he could see that their flat had been ripped open by the blast, every window gone, the bed and Jacqueline's cot filled with broken glass. But the flat had been empty. His family had been in Southport with him. They had escaped by a matter of hours. Newton never returned to operational flying. The Air Ministry considered him too valuable as an intelligence source and too dangerous if captured again in uniform. He spent the rest of the war on training and lecture duties, quietly teaching other airmen the lessons he had learned on the run. Roy Langlois and Richard Copley survived the war as German prisoners. Emil Whitmere was arrested but survived, later documenting the crew's story. The Basque guide Florentino was captured by the Gestapo but dramatically rescued by Tante Go's husband impersonating German officers. Howard Carroll and Gerard Walquez each departed for Portugal, intending to reach Allied lines. In 1946, Jack returned to the Devoked farm in Belgium, where the shed that had covered the buried kit was gone, replaced by a potato patch, but the hole still held their uniforms and flying gear. He excavated the remains and later donated his flying helmet, scarf, and boots to the Bomber Command Museum, where they remain on display. The torn page of Psalm 107 stayed with him through every posting. After the war, when the Royal Air Force Escaping Society adopted it as the official escaper's prayer, Newton knew it would always remind him of the nun who had given him shelter and the faith that had carried him home. He lived the rest of his life with Mary, raising their children and never losing touch with André de Jong, who survived the war, received the George Medal, and continued her humanitarian work in Africa. The number 13, which once seemed unlucky, became his quiet emblem, a marker of the date of his birth, his first home, the day he crossed from Belgium into France, and the day he left Gibraltar. If you have your own family stories from the Second World War, whether they involve escape lines, bombers, or quiet acts of courage at home, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments. We read everyone, and if you would like to hear more stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Thank you for listening.